I never thought I'd be the one to bring down a man of God. My name is Harriet, and I was 17 when everything changed. Our church, Grace Community Fellowship, was the center of my world. Every Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday, I was there with my family. Pastor David wasn't just our spiritual leader, he was like an uncle to me. He'd known me since I was 8 years old, watched me grow up, and always had encouraging words. My parents trusted him completely. We all did. He was charming, eloquent, and seemed genuinely devoted to serving God. His sermons moved people to tears, and his prayers felt powerful. Everyone in our small town of Riverside respected him. Little did I know that behind his holy facade lurked something dark and sinister. The Wednesday night that shattered my innocence started like any other. I'd gone to church for youth service, wearing my favorite blue dress. The air was thick with humidity, and the ceiling fans barely helped. I had no idea that in a few hours, my entire life would be turned upside down. The sanctuary smelled of old wood and candle wax, familiar scents that usually brought comfort but would soon become memories of betrayal. Youth service ended around 8:30 that evening. Most kids had already left with their parents, but my mom was running late from work. She'd texted saying she'd be there by 9. I didn't mind waiting. I often stayed back to help Sister Mary clean up. That night, though, Sister Mary had left early because her daughter was sick. I found myself alone in the church building, or so I thought. I was stacking chairs in the fellowship hall when Pastor David walked in. "Harriet, you're still here?" he asked with his usual warm smile. I explained about my mom running late. He nodded understandingly and offered to wait with me so I wouldn't be alone. It seemed like a kind gesture. We talked about school, my upcoming exams, and my plans for college. He'd always taken interest in my education, often encouraging me to pursue my dreams. "You're going to do great things for God," he told me that night. Then he suggested we pray together for my future. I agreed without hesitation. Prayer was normal in our church. We prayed about everything. The building creaked softly around us, settling into evening quiet, and I felt grateful for his presence then. Pastor David led me to his office, a small room behind the pulpit with wooden furniture and shelves full of theology books. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead as he gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. But then he said something that made me uncomfortable. "Why don't you kneel? God hears prayers better when we humble ourselves." I'd never heard that before, but I didn't want to seem disrespectful or doubt a pastor's knowledge. I knelt on the carpeted floor while he stood beside me. He placed his hands on my shoulders and began praying. His voice was deep and authoritative as he called on God to bless my future. At first, everything seemed normal. But then his hands started moving. They slid from my shoulders down my back, slowly, deliberately. My body tensed. Something felt wrong, but I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe this was how he prayed for everyone. His hands moved lower, touching places they shouldn't. I froze completely. Fear paralyzed me. This was a man of God. My pastor. Someone I trusted. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into eternity as confusion and terror warred within my mind. His touch became more invasive, and I felt tears streaming down my face. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My mind was racing with confusion and terror. How could this be happening? Why was he doing this? When he finally stopped and stepped back, I was shaking uncontrollably. "That was a powerful prayer," he said calmly, as if nothing inappropriate had happened. "God is going to use you mightily, Harriet. But this stays between us. Sometimes God's ways of blessing us are mysterious, and others won't understand." His words made my stomach turn. He was manipulating me, using God to justify what he'd done. I stumbled to my feet, mumbling something about needing the bathroom. I ran out of his office and locked myself in the women's restroom. I threw up. My whole body trembled as I cried silently, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd misunderstood his intentions. But deep down, I knew the truth. My pastor had violated me. My reflection in the mirror showed a girl I barely recognized, eyes wide with shock and skin pale with trauma. When my mom finally arrived at 9:15, I was sitting on the church steps, trying to compose myself. "Sorry I'm late, honey," she said cheerfully. Traffic was terrible. I forced a smile and got in the car. The entire ride home, she chatted about her day while I stared out the window in silence. How could I tell her what happened? She loved Pastor David. Our whole family did. Would she even believe me? That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his hands on me again. I felt dirty, ashamed, and confused. I'd been taught my whole life to respect authority, especially spiritual authority. Pastors were God's representatives on earth. Questioning them felt like questioning God himself. But what he did was wrong. I knew that. The next morning at breakfast, my dad mentioned that Pastor David had called. "He wanted to check if you got home safely last night," Dad said, looking up from his newspaper. Such a caring man. I nearly choked on my cereal. Caring? He was a predator. The orange juice tasted bitter in my mouth as nausea washed over me again. Chapter 6. For the next 2 weeks, I avoided church by faking illnesses. First, I claimed to have a headache, then a stomach bug, then cramps. My mom grew suspicious. "Harriet, you've never missed this much church before," she said one Sunday morning. What's really going on? I wanted to tell her everything, but fear held me back. What if she didn't believe me? What if she blamed me somehow? I'd heard stories of victims being accused of lying or leading men astray. So I mumbled something about being stressed over school and promised I'd go to church next week. But when Wednesday came, anxiety consumed me. I couldn't face Pastor David. Just the thought of seeing him made me physically ill. That evening, I told my parents I had too much homework and couldn't attend youth service. My dad frowned. "Harriet, education is important, but so is your spiritual life. You can't neglect church." Reluctantly, I agreed to go. Maybe if I stayed around other people the entire time, I'd be safe. I wouldn't let myself be alone with him again. My hands shook as I got ready, and I changed outfits 3 times, suddenly self-conscious about everything I wore. Youth service that Wednesday was torture. I sat in the back row, trying to be invisible. But halfway through, Pastor David looked directly at me and smiled. My blood ran cold. After service, I quickly gathered my things to leave, but he approached me. "Harriet, can I see you in my office for a moment?" he asked loud enough for others to hear. "I have some college brochures I think you'd be interested in." Several adults smiled approvingly. "See? He's such a good pastor, always helping the youth." I had no choice but to follow him. My heart pounded as we walked toward his office. Once inside, he closed the door. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone no longer friendly. "I've noticed you haven't been to church much lately." I stammered something about being busy with school. He stepped closer, and I backed against the wall. "What we shared was special, Harriet. God brought us together in a unique way. But you seem troubled. Let me pray for your peace." Before I could protest, he reached for me again. The air in the room felt suffocating, and I realized the door had no window, no way for anyone outside to see what happened within. This time, I found my voice. "No!" I shouted, pushing his hands away. "Don't touch me." He looked stunned for a moment, then his expression hardened. "Careful, Harriet," he said quietly, his voice dripping with threat. "You're a young girl with an active imagination. If you go around making false accusations against a man of God, no one will believe you. I've served this community for 15 years. You've been here how long? Your whole life? And your parents, they trust me completely. Think about what you're doing." His words terrified me, but they also made me angry. He was counting on my silence, banking on the fact that I'd be too scared to speak up. That's probably how he'd gotten away with this before. I wondered suddenly if I was his first victim or if there were others. "I'm telling my parents," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. He laughed, actually laughed. "Go ahead. Let's see how that works out for you." I ran from his office, tears blurring my vision. This time, I wasn't going to stay silent. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, fluorescent lights flickering overhead as I fled toward the exit and whatever consequences awaited my truth. That night, I sat my parents down in our living room. My hands shook as I tried to find the words. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something about Pastor David." They looked at me with concern. "What is it, sweetheart?" Mom asked. I took a deep breath and told them everything, how he'd touched me inappropriately while praying, how he'd threatened me, how scared I was. As I spoke, I watched their expressions change. Dad's face grew red with anger, while Mom's eyes filled with tears. When I finished, there was a long, heavy silence. Then Dad stood up. "That man," he said through clenched teeth. "I'm going to..." "Wait," Mom interrupted. "We need to think this through carefully. These are serious accusations." My heart sank. "Accusations?" "Mom, I'm telling you what happened." She reached for my hand. "I believe something happened that made you uncomfortable, honey. But are you sure you didn't misinterpret his actions? Pastor David has always been appropriate. Maybe he was just being fatherly and he wasn't being fatherly." I shouted, jerking my hand away. The living room suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in as my parents' doubt suffocated me more than Pastor David's threats ever could. He touched me in ways that were wrong, and he knew it. That's why he told me to keep it secret. Dad paced the room, conflicted. I could see the battle in his eyes, wanting to believe his daughter but struggling to accept that someone he respected could do this. "We should talk to Pastor David," he finally said. "Get his side of the story." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. His side? "Dad, he assaulted me. There is no other side." But my parents insisted on confronting Pastor David before taking any further action. 2 days later, we met with him at the church. Elder Johnson was also present, a stern older man who'd been in the church for decades. Pastor David sat behind his desk looking calm and collected. When my dad explained why we were there, Pastor David's expression shifted to one of hurt and confusion. "Harriet made these accusations," he said softly. "I'm heartbroken. I've always tried to be a spiritual father to her." He then told a completely different story. According to him, he'd simply prayed for me and placed his hands on my shoulders, nothing more. His performance was masterful, calculated, and I watched in horror as my parents seemed to waver, their faith in him battling their love for me. "I think Harriet might have developed some kind of inappropriate attachment to me," Pastor David suggested carefully. "Sometimes young girls misinterpret pastoral care as something else. It's unfortunate but not uncommon." I felt like I'd been slapped. "That's not true," I protested. "You're lying." Elder Johnson raised his hand to silence me. "Young lady, you need to be very careful about accusing a man of God. Do you have any proof of these allegations?" "Proof? How was I supposed to have proof?" "It was just the two of us in his office," I said desperately. "But it happened exactly like I said." Pastor David shook his head sadly. "Harriet, I'm praying for you. I think you're going through something spiritually. Sometimes the enemy attacks young believers by planting false thoughts and memories. I forgive you for these accusations, and I hope you'll seek counseling." I looked at my parents, hoping they'd defend me. Dad seemed torn, but Mom spoke up. "Maybe Pastor David is right. Maybe Harriet is confused or going through something we don't understand." I couldn't believe it. My own mother was taking his side. The office walls were lined with certificates and photos of Pastor David with prominent community members, silent testaments to his carefully constructed reputation. The meeting ended with Elder Johnson suggesting I apologize to Pastor David for bearing false witness. I refused. That Sunday, I didn't go to church, and this time my parents didn't force me. But word had spread about my accusations. By Monday morning at school, several kids from church were giving me strange looks. During lunch, my best friend Rachel approached me. "Is it true you accused Pastor David of something?" she asked hesitantly. I nodded, not sure how much to share. "Harriet, I believe you," she whispered. "He did something to me too, about a year ago. But I never told anyone because I was too scared." My heart stopped. "Rachel, we need to report this together." "If there are two of us," she shook her head quickly. "I can't. My parents are deacons in the church. It would destroy them. Please don't tell anyone I said anything." She hurried away before I could respond. So there were other victims. Pastor David had done this before and gotten away with it. The thought made me sick. The cafeteria buzzed with normal teenage chatter around me, oblivious to the darkness we were discussing, to the monster hiding behind a pulpit. That week was the worst of my life. At school, kids whispered behind my back. At home, tension filled every room. My parents barely spoke to me. My younger brother, Tommy, asked why everyone was sad, but no one answered him. I felt completely alone. On Friday, I decided to go to the police. I didn't care if my parents supported me or not. This had to stop. The Riverside Police Station was a small building on Main Street. Officer Martinez, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, took my statement. She listened carefully as I recounted everything, taking notes. "Harriet, this is very serious," she said when I finished. "I need you to understand that cases like this are difficult to prove, especially without physical evidence or witnesses. It often comes down to your word against his." My heart sank. "So you won't investigate?" "I didn't say that," she replied. "We'll absolutely investigate. But I want you to be prepared for how challenging this process might be. Are you ready for that?" I nodded, determined. "I'm ready." Her office smelled of stale coffee and old files, but her compassionate gaze gave me the first glimmer of hope I'd felt in weeks. Officer Martinez contacted my parents to inform them I'd filed a police report. They were furious. "You went to the police without telling us?" Mom demanded when I got home. "Do you realize what you've done? This will tear our church apart." "Good," I shouted back. "If the church is protecting a predator, it deserves to be torn apart." Dad looked defeated. "Harriet, we're going to have to find another church. We can't stay at Grace Community after this." "After what I did?" I asked incredulously. "What about what he did to me?" But they didn't answer. The next day, Pastor David was questioned by police. The investigation became the talk of the town. Riverside was small, only about 5,000 people, and everyone knew everyone. Church members rallied around Pastor David, declaring his innocence. A prayer vigil was organized to support him. Meanwhile, my family received hate mail. Someone spray-painted "liar" on our garage door. My mom cried constantly. My dad barely looked at me. I began to wonder if I'd made everything worse by speaking up. Our once peaceful neighborhood now felt hostile, with neighbors averting their eyes when we passed, their judgment heavy and suffocating in the air. Then something unexpected happened. 2 weeks after I filed my report, Officer Martinez called me. "Harriet, another young woman has come forward with similar allegations against Pastor David. She's 20 now, but claims he assaulted her when she was 16. My hands trembled holding the phone. "Who is she?" "I can't share her identity, but this strengthens your case significantly. With 2 accusers, we're taking this to the district attorney." Hope flickered in my chest for the first time in weeks. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. Maybe justice was possible. 3 days later, a third victim came forward. Then a fourth. All of them with similar stories, Pastor David had touched them inappropriately under the guise of prayer. He'd threatened them, manipulated them, and used his spiritual authority to silence them. The news spread like wildfire through Riverside. Suddenly, people who'd called me a liar were questioning everything they thought they knew. The church board held an emergency meeting. Pastor David was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. But many members still defended him, convinced this was all a conspiracy against a righteous man. The tide was turning slowly, but each new voice added weight to the truth I'd been screaming into the void alone. The district attorney, a sharp woman named Ms. Chen, decided to press charges. Pastor David was arrested on 4 counts of sexual assault of a minor. The day they took him away in handcuffs, half the town celebrated while the other half mourned. I watched the news coverage from our living room, feeling a mix of vindication and sadness. Even after everything, part of me had hoped my accusations were somehow wrong, that the man I'd trusted and looked up to wasn't really a monster. But he was. The evidence made that clear. In the weeks leading up to the trial, my family slowly began to heal. My parents finally, really, listened to my story without defensiveness. Mom apologized through tears for not believing me immediately. I was scared, she admitted. Scared of what it meant if you were telling the truth. Scared of how our community would react. But that's no excuse. I should have protected you, and I'm so sorry I didn't. Dad held me tight, his own apology equally heartfelt. You were so brave, Harriet. Braver than any of us. I'm proud of you. The evening news showed Pastor David's mugshot, and I felt something shift inside me, not quite closure, but the beginning of it, the first step toward reclaiming my stolen peace. The trial began on a cold November morning. The courthouse was packed with people from church, reporters, and curious onlookers. I was called to testify first. Standing in that courtroom, looking at Pastor David in his defendant's chair, I felt my courage waver. His lawyer, Mr. Thompson, was aggressive during cross-examination. Isn't it true you had a crush on Pastor David? He asked. No, I answered firmly. Isn't it true you felt rejected when he didn't return your feelings, so you fabricated this story? That's not what happened. Isn't it true you're seeking attention and money through these false accusations? No. I'm telling the truth. The questions went on for what felt like hours. Mr. Thompson tried to paint me as a troubled teenager with an overactive imagination. But I didn't break. I told my story clearly and consistently. When the other victims testified, their accounts mirrored mine. Pastor David's lawyer couldn't explain why 4 different young women, who didn't know each other well, would tell such similar lies. The prosecution presented evidence too, text messages Pastor David had sent some victims, testimony from a church janitor who'd seen him alone with young girls frequently. The judge's stern expression never wavered as the pattern of abuse became undeniable, piece by devastating piece building an unshakable case. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Expert witnesses explained grooming tactics used by predators in positions of trust. A psychologist testified about trauma responses and why victims often delay reporting abuse. Throughout it all, Pastor David maintained his innocence. He took the stand in his own defense, portraying himself as a devoted servant of God being persecuted for his faith. These accusations are spiritual warfare, he declared. The enemy attacks those who are effective for God's kingdom. But the jury didn't buy it. On November 20th, after 3 days of deliberation, they returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered while others sobbed. Pastor David's wife collapsed in her seat. I sat there in shock, unable to fully process what had just happened. We'd won. Justice had actually prevailed. During sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge was stern. Mr. Anderson, you abused your position of spiritual authority to prey on vulnerable young women. You betrayed their trust and the trust of an entire community. Your actions caused immeasurable harm. He sentenced Pastor David to 20 years in prison. The gavel's final bang echoed through the courtroom, a sound that reverberated through my soul like the closing of a dark chapter and the tentative opening of a new one. After the trial ended, Riverside slowly began to heal. Grace Community Fellowship underwent major changes. New leadership was installed, and policies were implemented to protect children and teenagers. Mandatory training on recognizing and preventing abuse became required for all staff and volunteers. Some members left the church, too hurt and disillusioned to stay. Others remained, committed to rebuilding. My family decided to stay and be part of the healing process. Elder Johnson, who doubted me during that awful meeting, personally apologized. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I prioritized protecting the institution over protecting you. That was a failure of my faith and my responsibility. Please forgive me." I did forgive him, not because what he did was okay, but because holding on to anger would only hurt me. The other victims and I formed a support group. We met weekly, sharing our experiences and supporting each other through the healing process. Rachel finally told her parents what happened, and while it was difficult, they believed her and got her into therapy. We all needed therapy. The trauma didn't disappear just because Pastor David was behind bars. Our Tuesday evening meetings became sacred spaces where tears flowed freely and truth was honored without judgment or shame from anyone present. Months passed. I returned to school and tried to rebuild some normalcy in my life. College applications became my focus, a way to look forward instead of backward. I applied to schools far from Riverside, ready for a fresh start. In February, I was accepted to State University with a full scholarship. My parents were thrilled. The day I got my acceptance letter, Dad hugged me and said, "You're going to do amazing things, Harriet. Not because of what happened to you, but because of who you are, strong, brave, and compassionate." Spring brought more healing. The church held a special service dedicated to survivors of abuse. We were honored, prayed for, and publicly supported. It was emotional but cathartic. Standing before the congregation that had once doubted me, now hearing their apologies and affirmations, I felt a weight lift. I also started speaking at other churches about my experience. Youth groups invited me to share my story and teach about recognizing inappropriate behavior from authority figures. It was terrifying at first, but also empowering. Maybe my pain could prevent someone else's. The speaking invitations increased weekly, and I discovered that my voice, once silenced by fear, now carried power that could protect countless others from similar harm. By summer, I'd become something I never expected, an advocate. I worked with a local nonprofit that supported abuse survivors. I helped draft new church safety policies that other congregations adopted. I testified before the state legislature in favor of stronger protections for minors. The girl who'd been too scared to speak up was now speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. My relationship with God also evolved. I'd been angry at him after the assault, angry that he'd let it happen, angry that his church had protected my abuser. But through counseling and lots of prayer, I came to understand that what Pastor David did wasn't God's fault. Evil exists in the world, and sometimes evil people hide behind religion. That doesn't make God evil, it makes those people accountable. I found a new church that summer, one with a woman pastor who preached about justice and protection for the vulnerable. Hearing a female voice behind the pulpit felt revolutionary. Worship became healing again instead of triggering. My faith, though tested and transformed, survived. In August, my story attracted media attention beyond Riverside. Television producers and journalists sought interviews, wanting to share the story of how one teenager's courage had exposed institutional failure and protected future generations from harm. National news outlets picked up the case as an example of institutional failures to protect children. I did several interviews, always careful to focus not on revenge but on reform. "This isn't about destroying churches," I explained during one TV interview. "It's about making them safer. It's about ensuring that when someone comes forward with allegations of abuse, they're believed and protected, not silenced and shamed." The interviewer asked if I regretted speaking up, given everything my family had endured. "Never," I answered firmly. Staying silent would have meant more victims. Speaking up was hard, the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was right. And I'd do it again. After that interview aired, I received hundreds of messages from survivors around the country thanking me for being brave, for giving them courage to tell their own stories. Each message reminded me why this fight mattered. The week before I left for college, Pastor David's appeal was denied. His conviction stood. He would serve his full sentence. When I heard the news, I felt relief wash over me. It was truly over. That evening, our family had dinner together, just the four of us. The dining room glowed with warm lamplight, and for the first time in over a year, laughter returned to our table, genuine and unforced, a sign that healing was truly taking root. Tommy, who'd been quiet throughout everything, finally spoke up. "Harriet, I'm proud of you," he said. "You're my hero." I teared up. My little brother understood, even at 12, what I'd done and why it mattered. "Thanks, Tommy. That means a lot." Mom raised her glass. To Harriet, for her courage, her strength, and her unwavering commitment to truth and justice. We clinked glasses, and for the first time in over a year, our home felt peaceful. The trauma hadn't disappeared, but we were healing together. Move-in day at State University was emotional. As my parents helped me unpack in my dorm room, I felt both excited and nervous about this new chapter. "You're going to be amazing here," Mom said, arranging books on my shelf. Dad handed me a framed photo of our family. "Remember, no matter what happens, we're always here for you. We love you, and we're so incredibly proud." After they left, I sat on my bed looking around my new space. This was my fresh start, my chance to be more than a victim or survivor. I could just be Harriet again. The campus stretched outside my window, full of possibility and promise, a landscape where my past wouldn't define me but my future awaited with open arms and endless opportunity. College life was everything I'd hoped. I majored in social work with a focus on trauma-informed care. I joined the campus advocacy group for survivors of sexual assault. I made friends who knew my story but didn't define me by it. I went to parties, struggled through statistics class, fell in love with classical literature, and slowly, steadily, reclaimed my life. Sometimes I still had nightmares about that Wednesday night in Pastor David's office. Sometimes I felt triggered by certain smells or sounds. Trauma doesn't just vanish. But I'd learned healthy coping mechanisms. I continued therapy. I leaned on my support system. And I refused to let what happened to me stop me from living fully. During my sophomore year, I received a letter from Pastor David. It had been forwarded through my lawyer, who screened it first to ensure it wasn't threatening. In the letter, Pastor David finally confessed. He admitted to his crimes, expressed remorse, and acknowledged the harm he'd caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness or expect anything from me. He simply wanted me to know the truth. I read that letter several times, emotions swirling. My roommate found me crying in our dorm room and held me without asking questions, her silent support a reminder that kindness still existed abundantly in the world. Part of me felt vindicated, he'd finally admitted what I'd always known. Part of me felt sad for everyone he'd hurt, including his own family. But mostly, I felt free. His confession validated everything I'd been through, every hard decision I'd made. I wrote back once. I told him I appreciated his honesty. I told him I'd forgiven him, not for his sake but for mine. And I told him I hoped he'd use his time in prison to reflect deeply and perhaps prevent others from making his mistakes. Then I moved on. Years have passed since that Wednesday night that changed everything. I'm 24 now, working as a licensed social worker specializing in helping survivors of religious trauma and institutional abuse. I'm engaged to a wonderful man named Marcus who respects my story and supports my work. My family is thriving, Mom and Dad are active in church safety advocacy, and Tommy is in high school, confident and compassionate. Grace Community Fellowship still stands, now a model for safe church practices. And me? I'm happy. Truly happy. Not because everything's perfect, but because I fought for justice and won. I exposed a predator and ended his ministry of abuse. More importantly, I found my voice and refused to be silenced. That's my legacy, not what was done to me, but how I responded. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's speaking truth despite being terrified. I was 17 when my world shattered. But I rebuilt it stronger, and in doing so, I protected others from the same fate. That's something I'll always be proud of. The sunset paints my office window gold each evening, and I smile knowing that every survivor I help represents another victory over the darkness that once threatened to consume me completely.